much for accepting the invitation to take part in a very exciting conversation, I suppose. We can expect that because of the topic. How to avoid war fatigue in the Western world. Well, this is indeed, I think, one of the most challenging topics of the day. We are privileged to have a panel where most illustrious names and personalities accepted to take part in. And I would start with Ambassador Luminița ODOBESCU, who is a presidential advisor on European matters. Monsieur François HEISBOURG, who is special advisor and with the Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. Ambassador Sergiu CELAC, Honorary Chairman of the New Strategy Center, and one of the founding fathers of the NSC. And allow me to be a little bit personal. He is also the one who taught me what analysis means and to never make predictions, which I very much disregard. And Mr. Matthew BOYSE, Adjunct Fellow with Hudson Institute, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary responsible for Central Europe with the State Department. So, our panelists are ready. Allow me to have just a couple of words at the beginning. The issue of our debate is challenging and seems to grow hotter. We are 450 days after the beginning of the war, and there is hardly any doubt about the valor and resilience of the Ukrainians. At the same time, until the 24th of February this year, the humanitarian, financial, and military assistance provided by the US and the EU countries and institutions alone reached 133.2 billion euros. This is the Kiel Institute data. Speakers have been asked kindly to focus in their remarks on future-oriented assessments and possible suggestions. And they have 8 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A session. Therefore, Ambassador ODOBESCU, shoot.
It's okay? Yes. The organizer for the invitation. It's really an important, extremely important topic of our discussions, and in fact there are 2 questions here: how to avoid the war fatigue and how to cope with the consequences we are all facing of this brutal war. Well, we all know that we face a lot of consequences, and how to avoid, I wouldn't say now that we face war fatigue, because the population is sympathetic, is very supportive. The governments in Europe are trying to do their best in supporting Ukraine. I think, of course, the longer the war lasts, the risk, the higher the risk of having a war fatigue is. We all know. And this is why we should continue supporting Ukraine and Ukrainians to push back the Russians. This is the It's simple as that, I would say. So, and of course, we have to continue through all the means to explain our population why we are doing this. Because in the case of Romania, it's about our security, and it was very well explained by the president and by the prime minister, by the government. So this is important. It's important to explain our population why we are doing this. Because it's not one of the consequences of the war is that we all face a message, propaganda, disinformation, fake news. It's visible. And practically we also have to fight through a smart communication to fight against this hybrid war. And this manipulation, and we have seen practically this on social media, and there is a high risk with the hybrid war we are all facing in Europe, not only Romania, all around Europe. So practically we have to be smart, to continue to explain to our population, to continue to have the support of our population, and to continue to support Ukraine. This is, I think, the important point for all of us. So, and the second question, I would say, how to cope with the economic crisis. I think, and the social problems while resisting exactly Kremlin aggressive propaganda. If you remember last year when the war started, of course, we took sanctions, and we have seen the consequences started with the so-called energy crisis, and we had to cut any links with Russia, with mainly on gas and oil supply. And if you remember at the beginning, there was this discussion about the heavy winter. We as Europeans will not be able to deal with this. We will face big problems. But guess what? We succeeded to pass the winter. I think we succeeded to put in place, not easy, but different mechanisms at the EU level to improve our interconnections, interconnectivity, to find other suppliers. So united, we succeeded to move on without Russia. And Russia was one of the main suppliers of energy, gas and oil for Europe. And we succeeded to, and will continue in this way. And we have seen the massive propaganda before the winter and all the difficulties we face before the winter, but we have done it. So I think from this point of view, of course, we face difficulties. It was not easy, and we have seen the increase in prices for the energy. We have seen the inflation and with the economic and social consequences. But I think we also we found together at the level of the EU solutions, concrete solutions. I cannot say that it was easy, but I think at the end of the day, we have these solutions in the interest of our citizens. And it's the same with the mechanism we put in place to help Ukraine for the transit of cereals, despite difficulties we face, especially our farmers face, but we will continue to do so. And despite the propaganda of Russia on this field, is the same. You remember when the war started, and unfortunately, we have the influx of Ukrainians, and the Russians said, okay, it will be the next migratory crisis for Europe, and so on. And no, Romania and the others supported, put in place a mechanism to help every Ukrainians who flee from the atrocity of this war. So this is the way we try to cope. And I think what is also important for us is unity, coordination, solidarity. First, in supporting Ukraine. Second, in taking all the necessary measures to cope at the EU level, because we cannot be alone in this, and Ukraine is not alone in this war and facing the consequences of the war. But an important point for us, and we are still working, unfortunately, I would say, because we are not yet there, and sometimes it's more, we are reactive than finding or being of a step ahead in respect to the Russian propaganda and the hybrid attacks, I would say, from their sides. And this is a field where we should and we can do more, not only at the national level, but also at the European level. Of course, we have put, I can give you a lot of examples of what we have done at the EU level in these fields, but it's still not enough because we are reactive on this. We have to be one step ahead, and this could be done through this strategic and smart communication in explaining what's going on in simple words to our population. This is very important. It's important to avoid this war, the risk of war fatigue. So I will stop here, but ready to answer any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I just want to highlight one thing that caught my eye, or my ear rather. We are still reactive. That's something that looms over the whole war situation. We are still reacting to something. All right, Monsieur HEISBOURG, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, and I thank Ambassador ODOBESCU for her wise words. We are reactive. Of course we are reactive because the Russians invaded Ukraine. We didn't invade Russia. So there's a sort of logic to being reactive that should not prevent us from thinking strategically, but there is a basic logic of situation. 4 points. The first point is, well, there may be a risk of war fatigue, but here we are 450 days later, and contrary to the forecasts made very widely in the media in the spring of last year, the articles in April, May, June about the inevitability of war fatigue setting in before the end of the summer of 2022. I will be charitable enough not to name the authors of some of the prominent articles in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal in that regard. So the one big thing which has not happened is war fatigue. There's been erosion in the opinion polls, but limited erosion, and from a very high level of support for Ukraine and rejection of Russia. Second point, we have an expression in French which has come into our political debate, and not actually about Ukraine, but it also serves in the case of Ukraine, and that is, you have two kinds of problems. You have the problème de la fin du monde et les problèmes de la fin du mois. La fin du monde is the catastrophic effect, let's say, of global warming. And the problème de fin du mois is, do I have enough money to pay my heating bill? And this is where war fatigue finds a point of entry. We've seen it most spectacularly actually in Eastern Europe. when all of a sudden Poland, but also a couple of other countries, decided that they would not admit food imports from Ukraine. That was a fin du mois problem. And it was a very severe problem, I would add, which does not detract from Poland or other countries' strong, visceral support of Ukraine versus Russia. But it certainly didn't look very good, to put it mildly. Third point. In war, as in many other endeavors, but more so than in other endeavors, nothing succeeds like success and nothing fails like failure. If you are successful, you tend to avoid fatigue. We, as was pointed out by Ambassador ODOBESCU, we succeeded in making Russia lose the energy war. That was quite something. There weren't too many specialists in the field of energy who made that forecast. And I think we all feel quite good about it. Well, if Ukraine succeeds in the announced counter-offensives of summer, war fatigue is not going to be a big problem. There may be problems linked to the desire of this or that country to hold back Ukraine. Oh, you cannot attack Crimea, you cannot liberate Crimea. We'll have those sorts of debates. But it's not going to be about war fatigue, which is another way of saying that if you want to avoid war fatigue, win the bloody war. Provide the weapons to Ukraine that Ukraine requires. And here I'd make also a very optimistic note. If I look at France, but the same actually is true in Germany and in other countries. And that is, the French government has gotten more flack in Parliament and in the court of public opinion broadly defined from not giving enough weapons to Ukraine than for giving too many weapons to Ukraine. Public opinion is actually not the problem. And we saw it also at the debate in Germany about the Leopards. It was a Scholz problem, a coalition problem, much more than a public opinion problem. So that point should not be forgotten. And conversely, if Ukraine is seen as failing, whatever the metrics for defining failure are, you can be sure that war fatigue will come in. And the last point, and possibly the most operational one, setting aside the defining issue of providing arms to Ukraine, is that on the risk of war fatigue, the one which counts the most, positively or negatively, is the United States of America, for the very basic reason that the policies of support of Ukraine saw the United States taking the lead role, and a very welcome and positive lead role. For the fourth time in 120 years, the United States showed the Europeans what was the right thing to do, and they did it. So I start with plaudits to our American friends. Problem, of course, is that the Americans may change their minds. And if they change their minds, minds will also change in Europe, because that's how leadership works. It works in the positive, but it also works in the negative. And I need not tell you how the debate in the US has been rising, and the electoral campaign is going to see a lot more on this score. And of course, if Trump or a Trumpian candidate wins the election, chances are that the chief executive will decide whether or will decide that he has caught or she has caught war fatigue. And then we know what happens. In conclusion, what does that mean for us, folks here in this room? We have to ramp up the provision of weaponry and ammunition to Ukraine. Second point, vis-à-vis our American friends, yes, of course, we should do more burden sharing. That makes a lot of sense for all sorts of reasons I won't get into now. as well as risk sharing. Risk sharing means showing support for the US in parts of the world which are increasingly important to the US. That is not Europe, but the Indo-Pacific space. It would be a good idea to see more active involvement of the sort which the French and the British are already engaged in the Indo-Pacific arena. We send our naval ships to the South China Sea, to the Taiwan Straits as a matter of routine. This should become a European policy. I'd like to see Romanian sailors on some of those ships that go to East Asia. That would be a very nice way of showing our American friends that we understand that they have a global strategic interest in the Indo-Pac as well as in Europe. These are some of the things that we need to do. But once again, our starting point is actually pretty good. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. If I may have a bit of a quip, Mr. HEISBOURG, I think we would be even happier to have more Romanian sailors on Romanian ships in the Black Sea first, and then we see about others. But don't take me wrong. Thank you very much indeed for your intervention. And we move on to Ambassador CELAC, and we'll just recall that Ambassador CELAC was among also the founding fathers of the analytical department in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs back in the days, and also the one who made this department, called this department back to life in his first days as a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Romania in 1989, December. Minister, our ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you for the undeserved compliment. The title of this panel, the subject of this panel is somewhat intriguing because it invites a follow-up question: whose war fatigue? We may have considered a danger of war fatigue until the summer of last year, but it was always a fear of such a change of heart among the Western allies. And we wonder a lot less about whether there was war fatigue among the two main protagonists, namely Ukraine and Russia. And for a strange and unexplainable, almost unexplainable reason, the danger of war fatigue appears to be the smallest in those two actors, Russia and Ukraine itself. But to come to the subject, we are reminded that a week from now, on the 27th of May, Dr. Henry Kissinger will be 100 years old. And as we pay tribute to his wisdom and foresight, we might be well advised to take a page from his life work and to consider the notion of war fatigue from a combined temporal and spatial perspective in relations to the facts and reverberations of the Russian unprovoked imperialistic aggression against Ukraine. Much has been said and written in the past few months about that subject, expressing growing anxiety that after 15 months of a full-blown, protracted 19th century type war, the prospects of a resolution are nowhere in sight. This, it appears, was considered as reason enough to eventually cause Ukraine's partners and friends and donors to reconsider their options. One of the frequently cited sources of concern has been that in the broader geopolitical context, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine may distract attention and resources from other, no less important international issues. The prime example being the evolving situation in Asia Pacific. To this, one can object without taking issue with Dr. HEISBOURG, that in Ukraine we have a fighting kinetic war in the immediate vicinity of NATO borders, and the direct active challenge to stability and security in Europe as a whole. While the tensions in the Pacific, no matter how worrying, may be the result of China's resumed assertiveness and provocative actions in confrontation with the United States and its regional allies, but offers little likelihood, at least for now, of degenerating into fighting war. At least the Americans and the Chinese are talking to each other and seeking realistic ways and possibilities for a rational and pragmatic arrangement somewhere in the future. Any progress in those discussions may also have a positive impact on the endeavors to bring about a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. In contrast, obsessed with its unrealistic, fanciful war, Russia doesn't seem to be interested in any kind of talking. In Ukraine, however, there are no obvious signs of war fatigue. Despite huge human and material losses, the Ukrainians are firmly determined to fight until the entirety of their national territory is liberated and the country's sovereignty is restored. There is ample evidence that they see themselves as Europeans and are prepared to work hard in order to become worthy members of the European Union and eventually of NATO as well. The historic decision of the European Union to extend candidate status to Ukraine and also to the Republic of Moldova has charted a clear way forward. Even in the heat of war, practical steps, including legislative actions, are being taken to that effect by the Ukrainians themselves. So Ukraine's Western friends and partners are fully aware of the potential pitfalls in the road ahead. building democratic institutions in Ukraine, ensuring the rule of law, avoiding democratic backsliding, and engaging in the monumental task of post-war rehabilitation and reconstruction. That is why the continued engagement in support of Ukraine must go well beyond wartime assistance, because it is essential not only for that country and its neighborhoods, but for Europe's own prosperity and security in the future. Faced with the Russian aggression in Ukraine, transatlantic solidarity emerged stronger and as a meaningful force for good in the world. In response to the aggression, with the United States in the lead, the response was timely and substantial in both political and material terms. Far from being shaken by Russian attempts to sow disunity and discord, the Atlantic Alliance gained in strength considerably following the unplanned but very welcome addition of Finland and soon also Sweden to its membership. The dynamic of European allies' capabilities for deterrence and defense are on a steady upward curve and are hardly likely to slacken anytime soon. The prospect of reducing the capability gap between the European NATO members and the United States, which has been the subject of lengthy debates around the notion of strategic autonomy, appears to be now a realistic proposition. The recent announcements by major European military powers, Germany, United Kingdom, France, Poland, Italy, concerning their enhanced deliveries of advanced weaponry and other aid to Ukraine, belied current fears of a slowdown in military assistance. This confirms the fact that the support for Ukraine from the US, the European allies, and other like-minded countries is bound to continue for as long as it takes. This commitment is eminently believable. Naturally, the Europeans are watching with interest and some degree of apprehension the run-up to the presidential and legislative elections in the fall of next year in the United States, and the hopes for continued bipartisan pro-Ukraine position in the United States to hold firm are justified and keenly observed. In the case of the Russian Federation, the war fatigue has taken a different form. It is not episodic and reflected in the media, but cumulative and secretive. In spite of aggressive propaganda and repressive measures, Russians tend to be less emotionally involved, according to the Levada Center surveys, in favor of the war. There is a vague feeling of expectations for some kind of change at the top, but the ruling elite, military and civilian, seem to be consumed by petty squabbles and do not seem to be prepared to take the lead. But something is clearly brewing under the surface, And the more recent suggestions by informed observers draw attention to the gray but capable figure of current Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, who may be a more complex figure than most people think, beyond the facade of a grey and unimaginative bureaucrat. The fact is that just, lasting and workable solution to the war in Ukraine these days, if it has to have an end, the decisive word would belong to the Russians themselves. They have to operate the necessary changes in order to bring about at least a semblance of peace and cooperative coexistence in Europe. This is relevant also in terms of the effectiveness of the sanctions regime, which was wrongly conceived starting from the question, what would hurt me most in terms of sanctions if it were instituted against the Western allies? They applied that to Russia and it didn't work so well, because the resilience of the Russians traditionally, historically, is of a quite a different kind. And therefore, until and unless the Russian citizen in the streets feels directly the consequences of the worldwide opprobrium and supported by practical measures which reach the life of every Russian citizen in the street, we should not expect the pressure for change to come anytime soon. For the time being, it is easy to guess what the two belligerents are going to put on the table as starting positions for hypothetical negotiations, if they conceivably start tomorrow. It is quite obvious that the quasi-ultimatum tabled by the Russian Federation in January 2022, demanding a return to the geopolitical status quo of 1997, is a non-starter for Ukraine and Ukraine's allies and friends, and also to the international community as a whole. The Russian Federation, on the other hand, with its current policies and untenable claims, can hardly be expected to accept a sovereign Ukraine within recognized international borders, and God forbid, as a NATO member. But an endless, ugly war, fatigue or no fatigue, is even a worse proposition than a stalemate in the war. Experience, at least as we know it in Central and Eastern Europe, has persuaded us that freezing a conflict into a protracted state is a sure recipe for future disasters. However, we should be equally wary of a peace fatigue. Once we shall get down to the nitty-gritty of a post-war arrangement in Europe and Ukraine's place in it. Therefore, for all these reasons, it is not just desirable, it is necessary and imperative for Ukraine to win. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. There is a very, at least one message that I retained from your comprehensive remarks, and that is the role of the public opinion, both in democracies and non-democracies. This is something that has not been very much studied, to my mind. But Matthew Boyce, you have the voice.
Thank you. Do I really have only 3 minutes and 46 seconds left? Okay, well, I mean, I'm tempted to say, well, the question here we're supposed to be discussing is how to avoid war fatigue, and the answer is win, or do everything we can so that Ukraine will win, and then maybe we can turn it over for questions. But I feel like I actually have to say something. Although the theme of this conference has been basically almost every session I've been in has been talking only about, or has talking about resilience. And of course, this all plays into this. It reminds me of this great German phrase, alles ist schon gesagt worden, nur nicht von mir, which means everything has already been said, just not by me. So I don't know where I can pick up that hasn't already been said. I mean, this is a sort of, whether we're talking about Ukraine fatigue, war fatigue, compassion fatigue, refugee fatigue. I mean, the fact is Russia is counting on it to win. It exploits it, and it's a key part of Russian strategy. And we do kind of, even though this is a very, very important question, we play into that by discussing it so much. And by, for example, François mentioned it really did start very, very soon after the Russia's renewed invasion full-scale invasion of Ukraine, that we started already meeting. Oh no, well, how long are we going to be able to handle this? And of course, we've handled it for quite some time. Our economies our populations have borne it out, but it does sort of signal that we sort of wonder about our populations and so how long they will last. And in the United States, of course, this is an issue as well. You all have been watching the trend lines, the polling trend lines, and there was even a House resolution to Ukrainian fatigue resolution. People are asking, well, where is this aid going, and this sort of thing. And of course, then the energy prices, and then it plays into the election campaign, which is already really underway, and the cycle, and the primaries, et cetera. But of course, I agree with François that the counteroffensive, the success of the counteroffensive will be really key. If that goes well, it'll be easier to sustain public support for this. But we should really, I don't think we should overestimate this phenomenon and just talk about it, because we can't let it become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And of course, we have to remember, what about the Ukrainians? They're the ones who are bearing the brunt of this primarily, and while we focus on ourselves and our own societies, they're the ones who are suffering and doing such an amazing job that I'm just in awe of the Ukrainian population, and they're not asking, or I'm not sure they're asking this question as much as we are, because they've already decided what their answer is. So anyway, we know what's at stake. We know what the kinds of ramifications this has for the European security order, and how it's connected to how it will reverberate far beyond Europe's shores or Europe's borders, and of course how connected it is with the other big strategic question of the century, which is the China problem. But what do we need here? Just sort of, since I've got 26 seconds left or something, we touched upon it to some extent, but I'm not sure I really heard the word leadership yet. It requires leadership because our leaders are not all of our leaders are talking about this as much as they should. I mean, yesterday, of course, at the opening session, Prime Minister Chuka mentioned this, what I thought was very important. And of course, we see it in some countries, but we don't see it everywhere. And I think this is the longer this drags on, the more we do need messages, like consistent and sort of message appeals to the population, because this is sort of I wouldn't say this is a kind of a political process right now. Our societies have bought into this. You see more Ukrainian flags in parts of in the United States sometimes than you see American flags. I'm exaggerating a little, but you see Ukrainian flags all over the place. It's so the wellspring of support is still substantial, even if some of the polls suggest that some of the support is sliding a bit. But anyway, we need this leadership. We need. And we also need weapons. We need more weapons, I'm afraid. That we're seeing, these were coming a little bit sort of, they were sort of slow at the beginning. And of course, a lot of Americans who were wondering about, well, how would our dearly beloved allies be handling, sort of coming with us on this? It was faster in some cases than others. And I must say that the more the American voter sort of sees other countries pulling their fair share, the more likely they are to themselves sort of say yes, we can buy into that. I must say even the Biden administration has not always delivered as much as it could have, as quickly as it could. So we need a lot of that. We need more lethality. We need it faster. Otherwise, we also need stronger countermeasures in the information space. Obviously, so much has been talked about with more media literacy. We need what are the role of the tech companies in terms of sort of providing Russia with such good platforms. Is there a role for AI to combat this sort of stuff? It's whack-a-mole is not really a solution, but we do need to really devote a lot of attention to that, because that's where these narratives spread, and that's where populations start to get sort of buying into sort of weird narratives about what's actually happening and how this this is a big deal we need to work on. We also need a more assertive approach towards to the adversary, to the enemy, however you want to call it. Messaging to the Russian population, and that advertisement that went out on Telegram the other day, or that the agency put out, I thought was rather interesting. We also need to attack and degrade these malign networks more assertively, identify and target them. Forgetting about timidity, because so often some of our sort of on our side of this, we see a certain amount of negotiating with ourselves and wondering whether we should really do what we really should do, and this out of fear or out of whatever else. There are a lot of explanations for that, but we need to show no timidity there. And of course, there are all sorts of economic and other solutions that we would have, but this isn't really a time for defense. And because the Ukrainian people are suffering, the world, this is so connected to the larger question of China, and not like in some cases, because there's this debate in the United States about, well, shouldn't we really be thinking more about China? Then this is sort of a sideshow. Well, no, this is not a sideshow, although that is a legitimate debate to have. But and I'm glad we're having it. But I really think this is interrelated linked, and we need to see this. And if we want to maintain the order that has enabled so much prosperity and so much peace and so much freedom, and for so many billions of people, that we just need to we need to do as much as we can to and I'll stop there because we're already over.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all. And I'm afraid you will have to keep in mind your questions that you might have had. And I'm not that preposterous to draw conclusions here, but allow me to recall what a wise character in a bestseller said. There comes a time when you have to choose between what is right and what is easy. That time, I think, has come. And in this respect, I just want to mention an example Ambassador ODOBESCU talked about, how we switched the energy issue and we solved it. Beautifully done. Excellent reforms. Aren't there any other domains where reforms are so badly needed and so much postponed? And okay, never mind, we'll take it when the time comes, and now, oops, the time has come. And this reform would mean that we also have, when the time is right, the offer to others to follow, and not let these offers come from other parts. Thank you very much indeed for your patience. Don't forget, between you and the lunch, you have 3 other panels right now, one across the hallway on Turkey's, on the transatlantic cooperation. The other one is on Turkey's foreign policy, quite important, I think, at the first floor. And the last but not least, the Wagner Group and the participation in the Russian war. This one is by invitation only. Thank you very much and have a great afternoon.